This morning, I want to challenge us with a very difficult text that comes out of this morning's Torah reading. It's in chapter 7, verses 16 through 24. I'm only going to read a little bit of it. It starts, Ve'achalta et kol ha'amim asher Adonai Elohecha noten lach. You shall destroy all the people that your God Adonai delivers to you, showing them no pity. And you shall not worship their gods, for that would be a snare to you. And then towards the end of the passage, Unatanam Adonai Elohecha lefanecha, v'hamam mehuma gedola ad hishamdam. The Lord your God will deliver them to you, throwing them into an utter panic until they are wiped out. God will deliver their kings into your hand, and you should obliterate their name from under the heavens. No one shall stand up to you until you have wiped them out. That's the passage. Deuteronomy 7, 16 through 24. It refers to what happens when Bnei Israel, when the Israelites are to enter the land of Canaan, are to enter the land and conquer it. The instructions are quite clear. People that are there, not only are you to wipe them out, but you're to obliterate their name such that there will be no future memory of who they were, of who they are. Now, how do we deal with difficult texts such as this within the Torah that seem to are contrary to our perceived sets of morality and to what we understand the Torah ideally to be about in terms of an inspirational text, inspiring us to better living, to higher morality, to more goodness, to more peace. How do we deal with it? On the one hand, this text seems so utterly wrong that we are tempted to, quite frankly, simply reject it, or to put it in a historical context of its time and to say, that's not who we are, that's not how we deal with problems today. On the other hand, we have to acknowledge that we continue to have some enemies that want to do us such harm that perhaps if we were to take a completely passive approach, we would be doing self-harm and opening ourselves up to the vulnerability of attack and being obliterated ourselves. Moshe Weinfeld, in his commentary on Devarim in the Anchor Bible, observes that even by the time of the rabbis, 2,000 years ago, the rabbis indeed could not conceive of the removal of the Canaanites in such a cruel and radical manner. And they circumvented the plain meaning of the text by reinterpreting Joshua's conquest. They reinterpreted it. Torah Tamima, one of the midrashim and commentaries on this text, writes, Va'achalta v'gomer. In interpreting the word ve'achalta, you should consume, you should utterly destroy. Rabbi Huna said, why is it forbidden to rob an idolater? Why can't you rob an idolater? As it is said, and you shall eat all the nations which the Lord your God gives you, while they are in your hands. Not when they are not in your hands to come to them. Meaning that this text is read in a very, very narrow way. You only destroy your enemies at the moment in which they're in your hands, and when not doing so would have a negative consequence on you. You can't just go out lahadchila from the get-go and provide harm to your enemies when there's no imminent attack on you. And so he learns from this text that that's why even though someone who's an idolater, who's considered an enemy to Israel at the time of the Talmud, even though that person might be an idolater, you have no right to to go and to be proactive in causing harm to somebody else. So he's narrowly interpreting the text. Even in the modern circumstance, I remember very clearly during one of the Gaza operations of Israel against Hamas, in my previous job, I went to Israel on an emergency mission, and it was a small group of us, and we sat with General Yaakov Amidror. Amidror at the time was Bibi Netanyahu's national security advisor. He's a former major general, and he was the head of the research department of the Israeli military intelligence. And he was telling us about what Israel's options were with regard to the Palestinians, Hamas, and Gaza. He said quite plainly, and it was jarring to hear it, he says, we could wipe them out, no problem. We have the planes, we have the munitions. It would take maybe a couple of days, but we have the power absolutely to obliterate Gaza, to destroy every building that's there, kill every soul that lives there. He says, but we can't do that. That goes against our values and who we are as a people and our understanding of what it means to be vulnerable and a victim. That the moral consequence of doing such an action, even though it was in our power, was so unimaginable that no Israeli general, and certainly at that time, no Israeli leader, would contemplate such an action. So he said, what are our options? We can retake Gaza. That'll take about 6 weeks to do. But then it'll take us 6 months to clear it out, meaning we'd have to go door to door, we'd have to overcome booby traps, there'd be fights in the streets with the Hamas militants, there would be hundreds of Israeli dead and thousands of Palestinian dead. And then, even if the Israeli population would be willing to do that, which it is not, which is why Israel has not retaken Gaza amidst all the mishigas that has gone on, then you have to hold it. And you become an occupier again of 2 million people that don't want you there, where you're constantly fighting back and forth in order to hold the territory. And his point is that the only option, ultimately, is a diplomatic one. It's the only option. But in the absence of a partner and the ability to have a diplomatic option, we're stuck in this cycle of asymmetric conflicts every so often. Right? But I remember it so clearly because of the first part of this, which is in relationship to this morning's Torah reading. Israel has the power to solve the Palestinian problem in a way that the Torah would command. But it's not a command that Israel would follow, and God willing never should. Now, I was thinking about this difficult text in relationship to the death penalty that was issued this week for Robert Bowers, the shooter of the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh in 2018, October 2018, in which 11 people were murdered on Shabbat morning, and which reminded all of us about the importance of being vigilant with our own security when we come into our sacred space. Because the death penalty in our tradition is also a difficult text. The Torah, in many places, issues the death penalty. My Jewish Learning came out with a very good summary of the death penalty within Jewish tradition. In the Torah, the death penalty is issued for a range of crimes. They include ritual infractions, such as violating Shabbat, worshiping idols, cursing God, sexual sins that include incest, adultery, anal sex between men for the Torah, and bestiality, and the death penalty for criminal acts, including murder, kidnapping, giving false testimony in a capital case, and so forth. The Bible, later in Deuteronomy, will see the Ben Sorer Moreh, the wayward son, the child whose parents can't control them. The penalty for that is death, for being so mischievous, so uncontrollable, so wild, and so contrary to one's parents. The Torah very famously says in Exodus and again in Devarim, "V'lo tachos einecha nefesh benofesh, ayin ba'ayin, shen b'shen, yad b'yad, regel b'regel," that in issuing certain penalties for crimes, you shall show no pity, life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. This is in legal circles known as talion, and in the Torah, it seems like it should be taken literally, but the rabbis never understood it literally. They understood it always as a measurement. So, for example, how do you figure out what an eye is worth? You go to the slave market, and you compare the price of a slave who has 2 eyes with a slave who has 1 eye. And the difference in cost is the value of the eye. And so what the rabbis instituted was that if you take out somebody's eye, the penalty for that is actually a monetary compensation, and the value is the value of the eye. Think about it in modern circles. If you are injured on the job and you're disabled and you're no longer able to work, how do they figure out what the value is of your damages, what your future earnings could be, and what job you might now be able to have, let's say if you had only 1 arm? Right? This is a very ancient concept that continues to be applied in today's legal circles. But on the face of it, the death penalty is something that the Torah doesn't shy away from. And yet the rabbis and the Talmud, again, they went to great length to establish significant barriers such that the death penalty was never implemented within Jewish history. They made the sentence extremely difficult to carry out. In Sanhedrin, for example, in order to be convicted of a capital crime, you needed to be convicted by 23 judges sitting on a Sanhedrin. You needed 23 judges to agree on the facts. And even more difficult was that the person who committed the capital offense, it needed to be witnessed by at least 2 people at the moment in which the act happened, and those 2 witnesses needed to warn the person, by the way, if you go ahead and commit this murder, this capital crime, the punishment for that is the death penalty. Right? So if the witnesses didn't warn the murderer in the moment before the murder happened, you can't apply the death penalty according to rabbinic tradition. That's how far the rabbis went in order to prevent it. Now, some scholars point out, like Rabbi Louis Jacobs, in his book, The Jewish Religion, A Companion, he notes that the power of the rabbis to impose a death sentence was ended by the Romans sometime in the 1st century. And as a result, the Talmud can talk about whatever it wants. But if there's no ability to actually do something, then the entire discussion in the rabbinic tradition is really theoretical. It's really theoretical. Until you come to the modern era, and you have the reestablishment of the State of Israel, and suddenly you have a sovereign Israeli entity that has the ability to not only make laws, but enforce laws and impose punishments upon people who break laws. So what do you do with people who commit a capital crime? Well, Israel only allows for capital punishment in one circumstance: genocide. which is why Adolf Eichmann, when convicted of genocide and crimes against humanity for his role in orchestrating the Holocaust, was one of only 2 people who were ever executed by the State of Israel. The other person was a case shortly after Israel's establishment in 1948, when an army officer, Meir Tobiansky, was executed for treason after a court-martial in which he had no legal representation. And Israel, years later, realizing the mistake that they had made in implementing the death penalty for a whole sorts of reasons, posthumously exonerated and reburied him in a military ceremony with full honors. And no other death penalty had been imposed in Israel since. Because our people take a look at the Torah, and when it comes to very challenging texts, are not afraid to reinterpret it based on our contemporary understanding and circumstances of morality. In fact, the Mishnah in Makot, when it speaks about the death penalty, says that a Sanhedrin that executes a transgressor once in 7 years is characterized as destructive. Since the Sanhedrin would subject the testimony to exacting scrutiny, it was extremely rare for a defendant to be executed. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, this categorization applies to a Sanhedrin that executes a transgressor once in 70 years. Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva say, if we had been members of the Sanhedrin, we would have conducted trials in a manner whereby no person would have ever been executed. To which Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, in adopting their approach, that they too would increase the number of murderers among the Jewish people, that the death penalty would lose its deterrent value, as all potential murderers would know that no one is ever executed. And yet, that is the position that took hold. No Sanhedrin would impose the death penalty, for it understood the inherent risks of the state executing people guilty of capital crimes. So how then do we make the switch from these difficult texts, and especially notions of death penalty, to something more positive from the Torah? Rabbi Sharon Brous wrote in the moments after the death penalty was imposed for the Pittsburgh shooter, that killing a killer does not prove that Jewish lives have value. Justice would have been accomplished through a life sentence. She goes on, our Jewish joy, our Jewish vitality, our Shabbat dinners, our B'nai Mitzvah, our Jewish writing and comedy and art, our Jewish chutzpah, the chutzpah of our continued existence, and the Jewish call to justice, these are the greatest testaments to how much Jewish life matters. In other words, we need not impose the death penalty, and we need not impose the harshest standards of fighting our enemies in times of conflict and war in order to justify or understand the value of Jewish life. Our Jewish life value does not come from the imposition of these acts on other people. The value of our Jewish life comes from living Jewishly. And perhaps Sharon was echoing the conclusion of this morning's Torah reading when she said that. Ve'ata Yisrael, ma Adonai Elohecha shoel me'imach. And now, O Israel, you know what it is that God demands of you. Ultimately, what is it that God demands of us? Only this: to revere God, to walk in divine paths, to love and serve God with all our heart and soul, keeping God's commandments and laws, which I enjoin you upon this day, l'tov lach, for your good, for your good.